Living up to your full potential is almost impossible when there is violence in the home. Intimate partner and domestic violence is an issue that continues to plague many in our society. It is not limited by class, it is not defined by a certain income, and its effects ripple out beyond the homes where it breeds. It is an issue that damages the spirits of both victims and perpetrators, and it revolves around relationship dynamics, anger management and respect, or the lack thereof. Today, we'll be hearing new research and insights on domestic and intimate partner violence, and we hope that with this new information, we can formulate new solutions and truly start to change the narrative.
Dr. Gabrielle Hosein holds a BA in Political Science from the University of Toronto and an MPhil in Gender and Development Studies from the University of the West Indies and a PhD in Anthropology from University College London. Her current research areas are politics and governance, Caribbean feminisms, Indo-Caribbean feminist theorizing, and sexualities. She's a lecturer, head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, and has been involved in Caribbean feminist movement building for 2 decades. She also writes a weekly column diary of a mothering worker, now for the Wednesday's Newsday. Please welcome Dr. Hosein.
Good morning, everyone. It is really, really heartwarming to see all of you here. It is a room full of incredibly beautiful people. I want you to do something for me, which is put up your hand if any of you know a woman who has experienced violence once in her life. And now I want you to look around. So when anyone tells you that women have all they want, or that women have already won, the picture of what we know in this room and the women that we know is what you should remember. Today I'm going to say what I have to say, though men might take offense, because too much news headline say domestic violence. It's like one set of lovers who really not we friend. And the fact is, not news if the beating begin when verbal abuse was already happening. The first bruise bears no clues to the true extent that a woman who's been put down, reduced, and used has to stand up again and again and again and again and again and again. So this, my talk today, and why the time is now, is for all of McGill and them. Right? This is for all of McGill and them. This is for all of your girl and them. This is for all of our girl and them. Because we're going to create the solutions in the Caribbean, for the Caribbean, and by the Caribbean. Now, I wrote those lyrics to that piece 20 years ago. I was a young poet in the rap soul movement like Danica. And back then, we didn't have the data that we do now. We had attitudinal data, so we knew what people's beliefs and values were. We had perception data, how common people thought violence was. But for the first time, in 2018, we have what's called prevalence data, which is we know what the numbers are in relation to women's actual realities. And I want to share that data with you today. Now, why am I here? And why is the time now? When I wrote that piece, I was trying to explain what the experience is like when you experience intimate partner violence in a qualitative way, in a way that kind of touches you in your heart. Today, because I have the data, I'm making a different kind of plea to strengthen that, to say that there's a national basis for this call. What we know from the 2018, the most recent 2018 data is that as many as half of women in Trinidad and Tobago report at least one instance of violence by their partner in their lifetime. This includes emotional violence, physical violence, financial violence, or sexual violence. A majority of those women are in the workplace, like you all. How many women here work? I know I work real hard. How many women work real hard? Yes, right? And that doesn't mean like when you get home and you still have the mopping and the sweeping and you fold clothes to fold. So the majority of those women are in the workplace. And so for me, workplaces have a responsibility, and we have to support them in taking that responsibility seriously in ending violence against women. My argument here today is that intimate partner violence affects women's health, their mental health, their emotional health, their physical health. But it also affects productivity. Who has ever heard us talking about productivity as a problem in the country? Anybody ever heard this talk? Productivity is a problem, we have low productivity, everybody's so miserable. Right? But you know, we've never thought about addressing productivity through addressing violence. We've never thought about the impact that violence makes, and in particular, violence against women. And so my call is not just for productivity or national reasons, not just because there's an economic basis for doing it, but my call today is for the private sector to think about productivity for the first time and how it can be improved by actually improving the lives of women workers. The survey that I'm going to talk about is what's called a Women's Health Survey. It's a survey of almost 2,000 women across the country. It's a nationally representative survey. So these findings can be generalized for the whole population. And in this survey, 46% of the women in the sample spent at least half of their time in the last week at work. Those between 25 and 44 years old was 63% of the sample, and this is important, 32% of the sample were employed in the private sector. How many of you are employed in the private sector? That's interesting. How many of you are employed in the public sector? How many of you self-employed? Awesome. Right. So I'm going to show you some data that covers some of those different sectors. But my argument today is that intimate partner violence is not just a women's issue, and I'm sure what Dr. Katz is going to be talking about is that it's not actually a women's issue at all, okay? Violence against women is actually a problem of male violence, and the only way to end it is by ending perpetration. You want to reduce violence, you reduce the number of perpetrators. That's all you need to know, right? But today we're going to deal with it about why it's important. Why is it important? It's not just important here because it affects women, but because it affects women workers, right? Because we work, right? And in fact, you know, women in the Caribbean have always worked, right? Don't worry about this housewife alone thing. We came as workers, right? We came as enslaved workers, and we came as indentured workers. We have always worked in this region. So in the sample, as much as half of the women, as I said, have reported some experience of intimate partner violence at least once in their life. Now, this is a staggering statistic, don't you think, for a Sunday morning? 1/3 of those women in particular report sexual or physical violence from their partners at least once in their lifetime. So, in this room, possibly 50% of the women have experienced some form of violence from their partners in their lifetime. Same is true for women who are in the labor force. Right? As much as 52% experienced one form of intimate partner violence or another at least once in their life. 52%. Right? You know that bankers like to talk about, gosh, this is a bankers event. Oh dear. You know the chambers like to talk about. They like to talk about the labor force, the numbers. You know, we like to talk about workers, but we don't talk about the fact that workers are real people and real women with real lives and real struggles. And if we tackle them as human beings and their lives as human beings, right, as human beings who work, imagine where that could take the country. Of that sample, 32% of the women who were employed in the private sector experienced violence. And as you can see, This number was higher than women who were employed in either the public sector or women who were self-employed. Worth thinking about if you're from any of the chambers, if you're from any private corporations, Ansa McCall, BP, anywhere else. 32% of your workforce. If you have 2,000 employees, that's 600 women. If you have 30 employees in a credit union, that's 10 women. If you're in a hairdressing salon or an optometrist store and you have 10 employees, that's 3. And interestingly, mental distress is quite high. But what I want you to pay attention here to is that not only is mental distress quite high in the private sector, I think what's important is the extent to which it's even worse among women who have experienced intimate partner violence. Right? The numbers are much higher for those women who have experienced intimate partner violence than those who have not. And this is the final slide I wanted to show you today. This slide shows the rates of women accessing services. About 7% of women who report violence report to the police. And the numbers for going to other social services, including calls and hotlines and shelters, is about 3%. Where are those other women? Who are they talking to? Who's helping them? What institutional supports do they have? And how can we step in? So this slide, in particular, was the genesis of the work that the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies began to do in January, when we began to speak with members of the private sector about, if these are the numbers in terms of women who are going to state services, but 1/3 of women in the private sector, right, are reporting violence, and they're going to work, then our workplaces provide us with a space for dealing with this issue that we are not currently maximizing, and we should. And so if you're going to work, your job tomorrow is to go to all your coworkers and your boss, or if you're the boss, right? If you're the boss, to go and gather everyone and say, you know what? There is something we could do that we are not doing. Or, let me hear what we have been doing. Because I guarantee that most of us in this room have had a colleague or a staff member or someone who we've had to have a conversation with about something related to their experience of intimate partner violence. Anyone here been a colleague supporting another colleague around this issue? Someone who's come to work? Yes? Yeah? This data is really stark, right? If up to 50% of women are reporting and experience intimate partner violence, but only 2% are seeking services, and the mental health issues are high in the workforce and higher for those who've experienced violence, then there's a major gap in our national response. And you know who can make the difference? You. You can make the difference. All of you here in this room, there must be 500 insanely powerful women and men in this room. I mean, if I could lasso you all into a revolution, it'd be perfect. Right? But all of you, because all of you are going to work tomorrow, right? And all of you can take this consciousness with you and have a conversation with the people in your workplace and say, you know what? There's a gap, right? It's a gap that we know is affecting our nation. What can we do? So even though there's this data, I wanted to share some of women's real stories from data that the Institute collected last year in a large sample of about 125 persons. And the stories are important. One woman says, while I was working, he wanted my money, telling me how to spend it, what to buy, what not to buy. At some point, I was making more money than him, and I don't think he wanted me to elevate any higher. I used to feel I used to talk down to him. Every time I go into work, he hitting me, telling the taxi, don't stop for me. This highlights a number of things. One, just because you're making money doesn't mean that your life will not be affected by intimate partner violence, right? Intimate partner violence is not just a women's empowerment issue, it is a male perpetrator's issue. And what recent data is showing is that the more empowered women they become in relationships where men are resentful of that power, violence is actually an increasing response. So you know that myth that if you become empowered, you're going to be free of interpersonal violence. It's not playing out like that today, right? That violence can affect you if you're making more money. That violence can affect you on the taxi stand, on your way to and from work. So sometimes if you know a colleague or a staff member is experiencing this problem, there could be a fund in your company, whether large or small, to help women get a taxi to and from work because they might be being harassed at the taxi stand. Another woman said, when I started working, I moved environments. I would experience violence in the morning. I would experience violence in the night. I would go to work crying. Right? So the violence we experience reflects our capacity to be collegial with our colleagues, affects how we turn up at work. But, you know, there's hope. As one woman said, at my workplace, I used to tell my friends that if I wasn't talking, I might have been dead all now. And I had to get it out because it was stress in my life, so I had to talk. It's a shameful thing, but I couldn't take it. And this last line is really what drives me to be here today. I want to say that I'm here advocating. I've given you the what's the problem? I've given you the why. I think the private sector needs to fill in a gap, and I want you to give me the how. So when I end, I want to hear if you have any suggestions, any recommendations. How can we empower all HR personnel? How can we change our workplaces to break silences around violence? How can we empower all the staff members in any business to know what the first 10 steps are? How can we create places and programs or support for perpetrators? Because I'll tell you, perpetrators have nowhere to go, nowhere to call if they feel they're going to be violent, right? So dealing with perpetrators is also a major, major gap in what we do. And I want to advocate for that too. So as I conclude, and we go out to the floor, I would like to hear any stories you have of times you have had to deal with this, any recommendations that you have for how we can actually implement a private sector strategy, small examples, small suggestions, or even large ones. I suppose my goal is to say we should address issues of productivity because that's what we talk about, but my real goal is to sell a focus on women's health and women's rights through something that I think we can get buy-in for. And to tell you that it really could make a difference in the nation. And when we're doing this, the reason that we're doing it is for those of you that put up your hands and for those women that you put up your hands for. And because I want there to be a leading Caribbean-defined model that we can take throughout the region, whether we started in Trinidad and Tobago or in this room. Because this is for all our girl and them, right? I want you to say it for me. This is for all our girl and them. Come on. This is for all our girl and them. Once more, if you didn't say it. This is for all our girl and them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hosein. And thank you for that very eye-opening presentation. I think the statistics and your research has been very startling. Before I open the floor, because I know you will have lots of questions, this is a very interactive session today. I want everybody to feel free to participate in today's events. But I just know that there are a few people who are walking around looking for chairs. There are ushers putting in chairs. Be guided because you will have a seat. We want everyone to be comfortable and be a part of today's experience. So, any questions?
Not just questions. They gave me 10 minutes to hear your recommendations and suggestions, right? 10 minutes is plenty. I want everything that you got. So I'm taking any suggestions you have, any recommendations you have, any stories you have, or anything that you have to contribute that we can use to take ahead. Please.
There are people with microphones as well.
Hand in the back.
Dr. Hosein?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So in your definition of IPV, it included physical, emotional, and financial as well.
Yes.
My question was whether or not you think men are perhaps also victims of IPV, and whether or not they are ashamed to report it, and whether the Institution of Gender and Development has considered perhaps including men in your survey. Thank you.
Can we take a few?
Good morning, Dr. Hosein.
Good morning.
I have a special interest in the security industry because it's where I come from. And one of the things that I am going to do personally, I think all women need to do that wherever they are. I'm going to start a forum for women in security to discuss some of the challenges that they face.
Please invite us in the room.
I need to get some statistics from you because when you have the statistics presented before you, I like to reduce it to dollars and cents.
Absolutely.
Where it makes sense to everybody, the corporate industry, the chambers, etc. And we break it down to how can we help the people, and in most cases, the victims are female. So I think everybody has a responsibility, wherever you are, the industry you're in, to do something, and it can be very small, things like budgeting, support services, daycare services.
Absolutely.
Everything that can help the victims become empowered and do more and come out of this cycle. We have a lot of organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, but we don't come together. And we don't use the statistics to show how we can make a difference and break it down to dollars and cents. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good morning,
everyone.
Dr. Hosein. Thank you.
Yes, good morning.
I would like to make one suggestion. You overlooked for a moment by not recognizing women who are in senior positions that have got men working with them that are abused without being touched by the men's behavior. I would like you to give some thought to that. I have personally experienced it umpteen times. Secondly, I am involved with persons with varying types of disabilities. They may come from backgrounds that have seen some kind of authority behavior, as I would refer to it, so that they get into the environment and they begin to beat the young women who are there taking training as well. I'd like to ask you to look into that and see what assistance you can give to us in all schools, everywhere that there may be, that we can then know how to deal with these young persons. Thank
Indeed.
you.
Thank you. Someone over here.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Hosein, thank you for your enlightening speech.
Morning.
You said that to reduce violence against women, we need to reduce the number of perpetrators.
Yes.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think that one of the ways to reduce the number of perpetrators is to take the victims out of the shelters and put the perpetrators there where they would be able to get Now, you all are laughing, but I'm really very, very serious.
It's a criminal issue.
Nobody is taking us on in this country with domestic violence because the perpetrators are out there for somebody else to come along and become another victim. And until we get serious and we are ready to put the perpetrators into the shelters and give them mandatorily the therapy that they need, we are not going to see a dent in domestic or any other kind of violence. Thank you.
Can I respond?
A very good point.
Thank you so much for these really rich, this really rich feedback, and thank you for your suggestions about your workplace. You know, it's something it can be, it's as simple as all of your employees knowing what the 10 steps are for a woman who is experiencing intimate partner violence. So, you know, what is the step? How do you report? You know, and if somebody is to go with her, what do they need to know? And what is the follow-up? You know, women report and they don't even know that they need to leave the police station with a receipt. No one even tells them that. And then when they go to the magistrate's court to get a protection order, they say to them, well, where's your receipt? They say, well, no one told me. Right? It's as simple as that, right? So even if it's just education, so that every employee in your workplace knows what are the steps if you need to protect yourself. What are the first 10 steps? What are the second 20 steps? What are the third, 100 steps? even as something as simple as that can make a difference. So thanks for your suggestion. For the one in relation to men, so what I was reading from was a national survey that was done on women's health, looking at how women's health is affected by intimate partner violence. Definitely men experience intimate partner violence. The global data, and maybe Dr. Katz will talk about this more, the global data suggests that it is in no way comparable. And that is particularly in relation to things like threats and controlling behavior, sexual violence, for example. And even the Trinidad data suggests that men report threats and controlling behavior, and women report 80%. Women are 80% of the reports, 82% of the reports of threats and controlling behavior, for example. And when you add various forms of sexual violence as well, the numbers are vastly skewed. This is a problem that men experience as well, though. For me, the problems of intimate partner violence are intergenerational, right? So all of the data says, that if children witness or experience violence, that there is a much greater likelihood of them growing up to be perpetrators or victims, whether men or women, right? And so that, right, children's experience, we think that of intimate partner violence as a man-woman issue. It's not, right? I mean, it happens across a whole range of couples, of different kinds of sexualities and diversity, but also intimate partner violence has family effects and intergenerational effects. And so that's where we need to be starting if we want to deal with its implications for men and boys. And I did say that violence is a perpetrator issue. The thing is, just to be really clear, if you are a perpetrator, then you are entering into the system having committed a crime, right? At that, I mean, you can't just lock people up in shelters and retrain them, right? They're already in a particular system. The system needs to be one that is rehabilitative and not punitive, recognizing that these are men who are dehumanized by their own violence, often are dealing with trauma themselves that gets them into this position, but as well are operating in a society that still enshrines male supremacy over women. That's why men are the majority in politics, majority in business. They own 85% of the land. They're the majority in religion, right? They run things. It's only just the other day, Justice Rampasad said that women could decide who they want to have sex with. For the first time since 1986, when a male multi-ethnic parliament decided only men could have access to women, right? So we live in a society in which male domination is normal, right? And that's where the roots of some of this stuff are. So yes, we need more shelters for women, and yes, we need a lot more programs for men. I would also argue that we need places for men to go, or numbers for them to call, or people for them to go to when they feel they're going to be violent, because men who are going to perpetrate have nothing to stop them, right? They're going to head to the rum shop or sports field or home. Right? And so I would argue that those are sites that we need to deal with. But I also think, and I just want to say this, we're here today to really celebrate what's happening with women and to focus on women's issues. And that time is okay. We don't need to raise men's issues all the time when we are raising women's issues. We can deal with women's issues on their own. But these are great comments. Yes?
All right, good morning. I would just like to give a suggestion that going into schools, targeting young ladies, targeting their low self-esteem can also help, because I came from a school where a lot of the young ladies felt that they had to have a boyfriend, and however the boyfriend treated them, they had to take it because they needed to have this boyfriend. They didn't feel complete, they didn't feel confident, they didn't feel any self-worth without having this person. And if we teach our young women to come up with that upbringing of high self-esteem, of knowing their worth, of being confident and complete with who they are without anybody else, then maybe that can help them defend themselves mentally before it even starts or reaches to high domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ramdi. No, sorry.
Morning.
Go ahead. She has the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Hosein.
Morning.
Earlier, when you were speaking, you were saying that each of us knows someone who may have been a victim or so of some type of violence. What I would like to know, though, is when you have been speaking to that person, that friend, and somehow it's just not reaching them, what do you suggest that we do next? Because you get to a point where it is you've been saying the same thing over and over. You speak to them, you give them that listening ear. You think, you know, you're really impacting them in some positive way, but then they keep going back.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are impacting them in a positive way every time you say those words. Women go back sometimes 16 times to relationships that they leave because their sense of confidence or their ability to survive on their own or their fears about their children all play a role. But you know what often keeps women in relationships in Trinidad and Tobago? Nowhere to turn. Do you know how many women feel that a man will find them? It's on an island. You cannot escape. Women escape to Tobago. Women in Tobago escape to Trinidad. Right? So we think, in fact, that this was one of the things I tried to investigate was the extent to which our ideals of love, romantic love, forgiveness, keep women in. But over and over again, women said they had nowhere to turn. You know, so there's issues of confidence, there's issues of economic security, there's issues of how do you change your whole life and your children, there's the stress of it all, but there's also the feeling of being trapped in a small island where these things, there's a lot of silence, a lot of blame, no matter what you do. You leave your blamed, you stay your blamed, right? And not enough support. I would say keep talking. But just to let you know, the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, so we've been making this call since about January, and the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce has exercised a lot of leadership, and they are working with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence to develop a guide that you can use to help you in these kinds of instances. We are hoping that that guide can really be piloted with a number of organizations, First Citizens Bank, Answer McCall, BP and the AmCham companies, as well as those associated with the Employers Consultative Association. So if any of you here want to join that united front, Coalition of the Willing, if you want to call it that, please let us know, because what we'll do is we'll be able to see what the gaps in the guide are. Make sure we answer questions such as yours. So if somebody is in the workplace, co-workers, anybody, HR professionals, you know, employers, they can open it and see the answers to those types of questions. But my short answer would be, you just keep talking. You just keep talking. And in fact, a good organization to look up there on Facebook is called Conflict Women. It's run by a young entrepreneurial woman called Asiya Muhammad, who's super amazing. And her method is, you know what, they don't tell women to leave. They support them regardless of whether or not they leave. They're just there. Anybody here from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence? Right, so they are also doing excellent work. And Sabrina Maula-Baksh, who's the manager, you can also call and ask those questions. And I think, are you on Facebook? You're on LinkedIn? Oh. So what I was going to say is, when you find the answers, let other people know. Like, you'll be amazed that say, you know, I had this question and I got this answer. And just even sharing that can be a big deal for others.
Morning.
Morning.
Good day. So mine is just a simple recommendation based on the audience I see here. I see we have a lot of women here that are in senior management positions. So I just want to say, please start the conversation. Start the conversation with your employees, with your staff. We have a lot of ladies working. Now start the conversation in your small management meetings, in your general staff meetings. I know it's all about business and about the bottom lines, but this affects your bottom line. Productivity challenges. She mentioned that. Educate your women, empower them. This will take away from your productivity. So yes, it will affect your bottom line. Start the conversation. You are in the position, you are a woman. You understand. You feel for your employees when they are going through this. Thank you.
And insist that men be allies. Insist that men be allies. They don't have to speak for women, you know. They have to be allies next to us, right? At our shoulder in this struggle.
Yes, Gabrielle, thanks for that presentation. I want to suggest...
Everyone, this is Hazel Brown, women's activist for 50 years. It's amazing that she's everywhere still.
Yeah, but I want to suggest that we take an additional approach to this domestic violence, and that is to begin to measure the economic cost of violence to us in Trinidad and Tobago. Those numbers of dollars will be huge. And we had the experience where when we were dealing with HIV/AIDS, that when the University of the West Indies in fact began to measure the cost, it made a lot of difference to the kind of advocacy and the kind of support that we could get. But we haven't taken that approach to domestic violence. The Commonwealth Secretariat is interesting in supporting that kind of work, and I think that is the direction in which at least some of the work needs to be done on the measuring the economic cost of domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you.
Yeah, there are two things here. It seems to me in a room full of women, all of us would have relatives. We're working day and night, and perhaps in a world where individualism is taking over, it seems. We have to do a lot more in terms of who is our neighbor. How many of us know in our workplaces people whose children are being socialized for the boys to believe that they have the upper hand and the girls to believe that they are subservient. On a panel with Diana Mahabir Wyatt some time ago at UE, a young lady said, if you love the man, you go take the licks. We have to start socializing our young people to accept that their God-given talent is not to be suppressed because of what society here says about them. Another area where private and public sector can help is to do a lot more in the schools and at our university level. How are we educating our youngsters? What programs are there in our schools? I am amazed when you look at the kind of violence on Facebook in our schools between young men and women, both sexes attacking each other. All that is part of the overall situation in our country that needs to be addressed. So when we're talking about changing the narrative, we have to look at our education sector, and we have to look at each one, as Martin Luther King said, has to help one. Each one of us can do something in our workplaces, in our communities, in our families.
Indeed, it's kind of a national crime that we have no systematic program in schools to end gender-based violence. It's been called for decades, and we still don't have one now. And so I think every one of you should write a letter to the editor and call for a national program in schools to end gender-based violence. The toolkits are out there. The people who can do this work are out there. It just needs to be taken seriously.
Now, I want to make a suggestion and to impact again on on-site daycare in the workplace, something that, you know, can start with in very small steps, perhaps a room for women who are breastfeeding to be able to express, you know, that gives them that bit of privacy. And then we could go on to, you know, something that is bigger. On-site daycare, all the data shows that it increases productivity. And so this is something that we really need to address. We've been speaking about it for quite some time, and so we need this initiative to take hold. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to speak from, I just have two comments to make. I'd like to speak from the point of view of being a victim of domestic violence. In my youth, you know, in your youth, you assume so many things. Having experienced it, having to go to work with bruised faces, being the manager of a company, and having to face your employees like that, and having the biggest adrenaline rush by having to flee a country with my two children, and not wondering if he's coming behind me. Afterwards, to find out that it was a mental health issue. Of course, in my youth, I did not know it was a mental health issue. I would have thought, you know, growing up I was just in my early 20s, so I thought it was just jealousy, that sort of thing. You've never had that experience. Growing up in a very protected Indian Hindu home, you did not know what domestic violence was. So afterwards, I found out it was a mental health issue. The point I want to make is, having sons, so he was eventually diagnosed as being paranoid schizophrenic, right? I have sons, and what they've told us is that it's nature and nurture. So at some point in time, it could be hereditary. I am not able, if I suspect my son may have an issue, I am not able to take him to a psychiatrist because he's over 18. He has to agree. If my son does not agree, then he may have an issue that he cannot deal with. And that is something I think we need to find a way to address. If there's a mental health issue, how is this person, if this person doesn't recognize that they have an issue, how are we helping them? Yes? And so I have to keep convincing my children, would you like to go just to check, you know? And sometimes they say, no, I don't need the help. No, I don't think they're schizophrenic, but I want to make sure. I want to make sure that they're not, somebody that they are dealing with does not become a victim because they don't know. Yeah, so that's one thing. The second thing is, we're talking, and yes, I believe we should look at women first, and these are women issues, but we are the victims. We are not the perpetrators. It's like somebody walking down the road in a very skimpy outfit, and somebody says she's looking for it because of how she's dressed, right? We are not looking to be beaten or battered. Something is wrong with the person who is doing the beating and the battering. They need help. How do we help them? Because we are looking, when we talk about, yes, a safe home, how do we deal at work with, you know, how does this person deal with being battered? We are fixing the symptom. We are not fixing the problem. And the problem comes from men and women who have issues, right? Sometimes it's not a mental health issue. They just have had too much to deal with, and this is how they express themselves. This is how it comes out, and it comes out not because they want to, sometimes not because they want to hurt the person that they're with, but you know what, that's the person closest to them at the time. So we need to deal with, we do need to deal with the men and the women who are the perpetrators, and as this lady said here, we need to start from a very young age so people can, so we start to fix our society. Because we can't, when they're adults, they have already set themselves, they're already there, and it's a lot harder issue to fix. But if we start from very young, then we can start to fix our society and fix the domestic violence and fix so many other things as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Put your hand up. There's a young man in the corner who wants to say something.
We have time for just 2 more questions or comments.
Good morning, everyone. I'm reminded as we sit here today about that young lady who was killed by her intimate partner at Movie Town. He was returning the car that she owned, that he worked to make a living while she worked at Popeye's restaurant, I think. Similarly, that lovely Japanese girl who was murdered. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm sure many of you recall that some of our leaders made comments about the death of those women. I just want to make a point. In Sweden, when they were trying to find a new way to tackle prostitution, one of the things they started to do was instead make it a criminal offense to purchase sex. So instead, they started to tackle the issue of the buyers of sex. That required huge retraining of people involved in the criminal justice system. I think that this may be where we need to start. Yes, in schools, but we need to train our leaders. And the narrative that is in the newspapers, the narrative that comes over on the radio when these crimes are being reported needs to change. It has to happen in the offices and with our leaders as well.
Thank you. So, one more. This young man here in the corner has had his hand up.
Good morning, everyone. I just have a, excuse me, I just have a suggestion. I think just as there are particular requirements to apply for a job or be able to get a job, there should be a requirement to take a gender-based violence course or women in studies course to actually acquire that job. I think that would be effective in changing the narrative where gender-based violence is concerned in the workforce.
So we've come up with a couple of things. One is that we need to continue to advocate for systematic gender-based violence programs in schools at all levels, from preschools to secondary schools, and supporting that call is important. We've also talked about the fact that in our own organizations, just having the conversation about how people are experiencing this, what solutions do they recommend, and what can companies from small to large kind of change or implement is something you can do. The Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Institute for Gender and Development Studies are willing to come to your workplaces and to support you through this process, because we are interested in seeing what this advocacy for a private sector strategy ends up looking like in a year from now or in 2 years from now, as we move from Trinidad to regional and we make these kinds of what we've learned here on the ground something that can help women, other Caribbean women from around the region. And finally, I would like to say that I want you to keep in mind that 50% statistic, right? That 50% of the women will report, have reported, or will experience one form of violence in their lifetime. To ask you for a little bit of empathy and kindness, right? To let you know that both boys and girls in households are traumatized and affected over their lifetimes by witnessing or experiencing such violence in the family. To make a call for working with perpetrators, not men as victims, right, replacing women as victims, neither are narratives that we are selling, but to work with men to deal with the fact that patriarchal gender ideologies remain the ones in which we're most invested. And while we know that they promote respectability and everything else that Caribbean people like, quite frankly, they're harmful to women, they're dehumanizing to men, and they need to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Hosein.